The Peloponnesian War was not just a struggle for dominance in ancient Greece. It was a battle that put the very soul of Athens to the test. For a city that prided itself on its democratic ideals, the war exposed deep flaws, revealing how fragile democracy could be under the relentless pressures of conflict. As Athens waged war against Sparta and its allies, its citizens, soldiers, and statesmen grappled with questions of loyalty, power, and the limits of freedom. In the end, the war left Athens not only weakened but questioning the values it had once championed. Part 1. The Promise of Athenian Democracy. In the years following the Persian Wars, Athens emerged as a powerful city-state, its navy dominating the Aegean and its cultural influence spreading throughout Greece. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens entered a golden age, characterized by remarkable achievements in philosophy, drama, architecture, and governance. At the heart of Athenian society was its democracy, a system in which citizens gathered in the assembly to debate, vote, and shape the policies of their city. Athens' democratic experiment was unique in the Greek world, offering a level of participation and political freedom rare for the time. It was a source of pride for the Athenians, a symbol of their superiority over oligarchic rivals like Sparta. Pericles believed that the Athenian way of life, centered around open debate, civic participation, and personal freedom, was worth defending, even at the cost of war. Thus, when tensions with Sparta reached a boiling point, Athens entered the conflict confident that its democratic principles would guide it to victory. Yet, as the war dragged on, the ideals that had once defined Athens began to erode. The demands of wartime governance, the strain on resources, and the rise of factionalism created cracks in the democratic foundation. Athens was forced to confront a difficult reality. Could democracy survive the demands of a long, brutal war? Part 2. The Plague and the First Crisis of Democracy. The first major blow to Athenian democracy came not from the Spartans but from within. In 430 BCE, during the early years of the war, a devastating plague struck Athens. With the city's population crowded behind its walls to avoid Spartan attacks, the disease spread rapidly, killing nearly a third of its inhabitants. The plague not only weakened Athens militarily but also caused a profound moral and social crisis. People lost faith in the gods, in their leaders, and in each other. The death of Pericles in the plague left Athens without its most trusted leader, and the city's political landscape became increasingly unstable. Without Pericles' guidance, factions emerged within the assembly, each vying for power and proposing drastically different approaches to the war. Leaders like Cleon, a populist with a fierce desire for aggressive tactics, gained influence, while others advocated for moderation or even peace with Sparta. The assembly, once a place of collective decision-making, became a battleground for conflicting interests, and the cohesion of Athenian democracy began to fray. Part 3. The Sicilian Expedition and the Rise of Demagoguery. In 415 BCE, a young and ambitious general named Alcibiades persuaded the assembly to undertake the Sicilian expedition, an audacious campaign aimed at conquering the wealthy city of Syracuse in Sicily. Alcibiades, a charismatic but divisive figure, argued that this expansion would bring Athens glory and resources, turning the tide of the war. His rhetoric won over the assembly, and the decision was made to commit a vast portion of Athens' fleet and manpower to the expedition. Yet the campaign quickly turned into a disaster. Alcibiades was recalled to face charges of sacrilege and defected to Sparta, leaving the Athenian forces leaderless and vulnerable. The expedition, under the command of Nicias and Demosthenes, failed catastrophically. Nearly the entire fleet was destroyed, and thousands of soldiers were either killed or captured. The loss devastated Athens, both materially and psychologically, eroding confidence in the government's ability to make sound decisions. The disaster in Sicily also marked a turning point in Athenian democracy. The assembly, driven by Alcibiades' persuasive arguments and the lure of empire, had abandoned caution for reckless ambition. The influence of charismatic leaders, or demagogues, became increasingly apparent as politicians sought to win favor by appealing to popular sentiments rather than pursuing the city's long-term welfare. This shift allowed ambitious and often unqualified leaders to manipulate public opinion, leading to decisions driven more by emotion than reason. Part 4. Internal conflict and the oligarchic coup. The losses in Sicily left Athens weakened and vulnerable, and its enemies sensed an opportunity. The Spartans, with the support of Persian gold, rebuilt their navy and intensified their attacks on Athenian allies. Meanwhile, the strain of the war, combined with disillusionment over the government's failures, led to rising tensions within Athens itself. Some Athenians began to question whether democracy was the best system for wartime governance, arguing that a more centralized, authoritarian approach was necessary for survival. In 411 BCE, a group of oligarchs seized control in a coup, overthrowing the democratic government and establishing the Council of 400. These oligarchs, many of whom were wealthy aristocrats who had long resented the influence of the common citizenry, claimed that democracy was too chaotic and vulnerable to manipulation. They promised to bring order and efficiency, believing that a small, elite ruling body would make better decisions for the war effort. However, the oligarchic government was deeply unpopular and lacked legitimacy among the people. It was met with resistance from pro-democratic factions, particularly from the Athenian navy, which remained loyal to the idea of democracy. After just a few months, the oligarchy was overthrown, and democracy was restored. But the coup had shown how fragile Athenian democracy had become, its principles vulnerable to erosion under the pressures of war and political ambition. Part 5. The Fall of Athens and the Aftermath for Democracy. Despite its internal struggles, Athens continued to fight, but its resources were depleted, and its people were weary. In 405 BCE, at the Battle of Aegospotami, the Athenian navy was destroyed by the Spartans under Lysander's command. With no fleet to defend its trade routes and no allies willing to come to its aid, Athens was left isolated and vulnerable. The following year, after enduring a long and crippling siege, Athens surrendered to Sparta, marking the end of the Peloponnesian War. The terms of surrender were harsh. Athens was forced to dismantle its long walls, disband its navy, and submit to Spartan rule. Under Spartan influence, an oligarchic government known as the 30 Tyrants was installed, bringing an end to Athenian democracy. The 30 Tyrants imposed a reign of terror, executing or exiling thousands of democratic supporters. This period of repression highlighted the cost of losing democracy and deepened the Athenians' resolve to restore it. The terms of surrender were harsh. Athens was forced to dismantle its long walls, disband its navy, and submit to Spartan rule. Under Spartan influence, an oligarchic government known as the 30 Tyrants was installed, bringing an end to Athenian democracy. The 30 Tyrants imposed a reign of terror, executing or exiling thousands of democratic supporters. This period of repression highlighted the cost of losing democracy and deepened the Athenians' resolve to restore it. Eventually, the 30 Tyrants were overthrown, and democracy was reinstated in Athens. The restoration of democracy was a moment of pride, but it also brought with it a new understanding of the system's fragility. Athenians realized that democracy could only survive if it was supported by a foundation of trust, moderation, and civic responsibility. The war had tested these values and revealed how easily democracy could falter when ambition, fear, and factionalism took hold. Part 6. The Legacy of Athenian Democracy and the Lessons of War. The Peloponnesian War had a profound impact on Athenian democracy, forcing it to evolve and adapt to the realities of conflict. The war exposed the vulnerabilities of democratic governance, especially in times of crisis, but it also demonstrated the resilience of the Athenian people. Despite coups, factionalism, and the rise of demagogues, the Athenians ultimately returned to the ideals of self-governance, refusing to surrender their belief in the value of a government by the people. The experiences of Athens during the war served as a lasting lesson for future generations. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, deeply affected by the turmoil they witnessed, explored questions of governance, ethics, and the responsibilities of citizens and leaders. Plato, disillusioned by the flaws he saw in Athenian democracy, envisioned an ideal state led by philosopher kings in the Republic. Aristotle, though more supportive of democracy, argued that it must be balanced by principles of justice and virtue to avoid corruption and decay. The legacy of Athenian democracy, forged and tested in the fires of war, became a foundation for Western political thought. The city's struggles and failures illustrated the importance of accountability, informed debate, and a commitment to the common good principles that would resonate through the ages. The enduring spirit of Athenian democracy. The story of Athens at war reveals the paradox of democracy. While it grants freedom, it requires discipline. While it empowers